Governments often talk about economic stability, growth, and people having a better future. Of course, all of these are important issues. But when we take a closer look at history, we also see that financial systems have not always worked equally fairly for ordinary people. In fact, some economic methods used from the past to the present keep appearing again and again under different names and in different forms. Their appearance changes, but the results are often the same. People who are close to the system gain more, while a large part of the cost is spread across the rest of society. Let us begin with one of the oldest examples of this: inflation. When a state spends more money than it collects in taxes, a budget deficit appears. To cover this deficit, it can directly increase taxes. However, openly telling citizens that they will have to pay more taxes is not politically easy. Instead, the money supply can be increased, or the value of money can be reduced over time. This way, money is not taken directly out of people's pockets, but the purchasing power of the money they hold decreases. We can see traces of this method even in ancient Rome. In the 3rd century AD, the military expenses of the Roman Empire were steadily increasing. To cover these costs, emperors began reducing the silver content of a coin called the denarius. These coins, which were initially made largely of pure silver, gradually came to be made mostly of copper and were covered only with a thin layer of silver. The same value was written on the coin, but the real value it contained was no longer the same. As a result, prices rose. People's savings lost value, and wages could not keep up with the rising cost of living. Think about it. The amount of money you have does not change, but the number of products you can buy with that money gradually decreases. This is why inflation is often compared to an invisible tax. At that time, this process took place in imperial mints. Today, the economic system is far more complex. But when people's purchasing power declines, the result is still similar. When we come to the Middle Ages, we encounter another method: forced loans. In countries such as England, France, and Spain, rulers asked wealthy merchants and guilds to lend money in order to finance wars and palace expenses. However, these requests were not always voluntary. A merchant's refusal to lend money to the crown could lead to fines, confiscation of property, or even more serious consequences. The crown sometimes promised to repay the money with interest, but payments could be delayed, made in a devalued currency, or never made at all. So on the surface, this was a loan agreement. In reality, people had little choice but to hand over their capital to the state. This situation was often explained through concepts such as patriotism, loyalty, or duty. The important point here is this: economic decisions are managed not only through numbers, but also through the language that is used and the perception that is created. By the 17th century, the financial system had started to become more institutionalized. In 1694, the Bank of England was founded. One of the main reasons was that the British government needed money to finance its wars with France. Wealthy investors lent money to the state and received government bonds in return. The government guaranteed that it would pay interest to these investors. At first glance, this seems like a perfectly normal system. The state borrows money and the investor earns interest in return. But when we look at the source of those interest payments, the picture changes slightly. These payments were financed largely through taxes. A significant part of the taxes collected from salt, beer, cloth, and everyday consumer goods was paid by ordinary people. So, while wealthy individuals earned a safe interest income by lending money to the state, society as a whole contributed to financing that interest. This system continues today in different forms. Government bonds are generally considered safe investments because they are backed by the state's power to collect taxes. In other words, the return earned by the investor is paid through taxes collected from citizens in the future. Of course, government borrowing is not always a bad thing. If the borrowed money is genuinely spent on infrastructure, education, healthcare, or productive investments, it can benefit society as a whole. But the real issue is how the debt is used and who ultimately pays the price. In the modern world, budget deficits and government debt have become a normal part of everyday life. Governments say they borrow in order to fund infrastructure, employment, defense, social assistance, or economic growth. Some of this money is genuinely used for society, but at certain times large amounts of resources may be directed toward defense companies, major corporate subsidies, or financial bailouts. When the debt has to be repaid, taxes usually rise, public services are reduced, or the purchasing power of the currency declines. In the end, the gains may go to certain sectors, while the burden of the debt is spread across society as a whole. The 2008 financial crisis is one of the most widely discussed examples of this. Before the crisis, many banks issued highly risky loans. These loans were turned into complex financial products and sold to investors in different parts of the world. When the system began to collapse, governments announced major bailout packages to prevent banks and financial markets from completely falling apart. Failing to intervene could have caused far more severe economic consequences. So there were serious reasons behind the decision. But people naturally ask the following question. If banks keep the profits when they make money, why should society cover the cost when they suffer losses? After the crisis, some of the largest banks grew even bigger, and the concentration of power in the sector increased. This strengthened the debate even further. There is a common expression used in this context: privatize the profits and socialize the losses. This phrase explains that risk and reward are not always shared equally in the financial system. There is a similar debate around pension systems. In many countries, working people pay contributions for years and believe that this money will be returned to them when they retire. However, in most public pension systems, the contributions paid by today's workers are used to fund today's retirees. In other words, the money you pay usually does not sit in an account under your name. The system works on the assumption that people who work in the future will also continue paying contributions. If the population is young and the number of workers is high, this system can function. But when birth rates fall, people live longer, and the number of retirees rises, the system begins to come under pressure. In this situation, governments may raise the retirement age, increase contribution rates, or change the way pension payments are calculated. These changes are generally called reforms. Perhaps some of them really are necessary, but once again, the important issue is how the burden of those changes is distributed. If people paid into the system for years based on certain conditions, changing the rules afterward can naturally create distrust. Here we return to the same point: perception and language. Inflation is sometimes presented as a natural result of growth. Government debt is presented as investment. Bailout packages are presented as necessary for economic stability. Pension cuts are described as reform. Each of these explanations may be true to a certain extent, but instead of looking only at the explanation, we also need to look at the results. Who gained? Who paid the cost? Who carried the risks? What were the short-term and long-term effects of the policy? When these questions are not asked, it becomes difficult to see how the real costs and benefits of economic decisions are distributed. One of the concepts we began hearing frequently after the 2008 crisis was quantitative easing. Central banks created large amounts of money to support the markets and used it to purchase government bonds and mortgage-backed securities. The aim was to reduce interest rates, keep the credit system functioning, and prevent an economic collapse. These policies did help markets recover. But another result also emerged. The prices of assets such as stocks, bonds, and real estate increased. People who already owned these assets made significant gains. But households with little savings or few investments did not benefit to the same extent. For them, the result was felt more through rising housing prices, higher rents, and an increasing cost of living. This is why there are two different views on quantitative easing. One view argues that the policy prevented a major economic collapse. The other argues that it widened the wealth gap between those who owned assets and those who did not. Both views probably contain valid points. The main issue is that when evaluating an economic policy, we should look not only at whether the markets were saved, but also at how the gains were distributed across society. Another issue is hidden or indirect taxation. Income tax is deducted directly from your salary, and you can see how much you are paying. But sales taxes, fuel taxes, various fees, and inflation are costs that are less visible. Especially when prices rise faster than wages, people's purchasing power declines. Your salary may be higher than it was last year. But if your grocery bills, rent, electricity, and transportation costs have increased much more, then you are not actually wealthier. You may be earning more money in numerical terms while being able to buy fewer goods and services in real terms. Inflation can also reduce the debt burden of governments. This is because government debt is calculated in a fixed amount of money, and when the value of that money falls, the real value of the debt also falls. But the same process also reduces the value of citizens' savings. For this reason, the effects of inflation are not the same for everyone. Someone with debt may benefit to a certain extent, while someone who keeps savings in cash may suffer losses. People who own assets may benefit from rising prices, while those who depend on wages may fall behind. We encounter a similar situation with regulation. Governments create rules to protect consumers, workers, and the environment. These regulations are often genuinely necessary, but sometimes powerful companies begin to influence the institutions that are supposed to regulate them. This is known as regulatory capture. Railroad companies in the 19th century, oil companies in the 20th century, and technology and financial companies today have all been at the center of such debates. Experts and lobbyists working for major corporations may have significant influence over the process of writing laws. As a result, rules may appear to protect the public while creating major barriers for small businesses trying to enter the market. Large companies, on the other hand, can afford these costs and may therefore strengthen their position even further. So even a regulation created with good intentions can reduce competition if it is designed poorly. To put it in the logic of the television series Peaky Blinders, sometimes the easiest way to win the game is not to fight your rivals, but to stay close to the people who make the rules. The financing of wars has also created similar debates throughout history. During the First and Second World Wars, many governments sold war bonds to their citizens. People were told that buying these bonds was a way of supporting their country, and in reality, it did help governments cover the costs of war. But the bonds also provided investors with government-guaranteed interest income. These payments were also financed through future taxes. Large amounts of spending during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were also financed through borrowing. Defense companies earned significant revenues during this process, while the cost of the debt remained with taxpayers for many years. Wars often begin as temporary emergencies, but their economic effects can continue long after the soldiers return home. Perhaps one of the biggest problems in today's financial system is complexity. Tax laws can be thousands of pages long. Government budgets contain large numbers of items, programs, and technical terms. Even experts sometimes struggle to explain financial products. This complexity may not always be malicious. Modern economies really are enormous and complex. But the more difficult the system is to understand, the harder it becomes for ordinary citizens to follow where the money is going. It is not easy to understand how much support a particular company receives from a government budget, who benefits from certain tax breaks, or what the real cost of a bailout package is. When people cannot follow the system, it also becomes harder to hold anyone accountable. In ancient Rome, it was physically possible to see that the silver content of coins had been reduced. Today, however, loss of value can be hidden among balance sheets, interest rates, bond purchases, and technical terminology. The periods change, but the basic question remains the same. Who does the economic system work for, and who is forced to bear the cost? This issue is still important today because inflation, government debt, bailout packages, and central bank policies directly affect our lives. From grocery shopping and housing prices to salaries and pensions, we feel the consequences of economic decisions in many areas, but most of us look only at the outcome. We see prices rising, but we do not investigate why they are rising. We notice taxes increasing, but we do not examine where the money in the government budget is being spent. When a company is rescued, we hear why the rescue was necessary, but we do not ask whether the terms of the bailout were fair. One of the most important lessons history teaches us is that economic methods can reappear under different names. Rome reduced the amount of silver in its coins. Medieval rulers collected forced loans. Modern states use money supply, bonds, budget deficits, and central bank policies. Of course, today's systems are not completely identical to those of the past. But when we look at the results, it is possible to see certain similarities. When the value of money falls, people with savings lose. When the state borrows, future taxpayers take on responsibility. During crises, major institutions may be rescued while the cost is spread across society. Complex rules make these processes harder to follow. This is why financial education is extremely important. You do not need to be a professional economist in order to understand the economy. Simply knowing what inflation is, why governments borrow, how interest rates work, and what tools central banks use can help you look at events differently. When a stimulus package is announced, you can look not only at its size, but also at where the money will go. When a new regulation is introduced, you can look not only at its title, but also at who will benefit from it. When inflation rises, you can assess its effect on your salary, your debts, and your savings more accurately. At the same time, you can manage your own financial situation more consciously. Instead of keeping all your savings only in cash, you can research different investment options. Of course, no investment is completely risk-free. For this reason, people should not invest in instruments they do not understand. The goal is not to act out of fear, but to make informed decisions. In conclusion, the point being made here is not that all governments or all economic policies are malicious. States have many important responsibilities, including health care, education, infrastructure, and security. Intervention during an economic crisis may also sometimes be necessary, but no system should be judged only by its own explanations. It is always worth taking a closer look. Who gains? Who loses? Is the cost being paid today, or is it being left for the future? Does the policy benefit society as a whole, or does it strengthen certain groups? Asking these questions does not mean approaching every explanation with suspicion. It simply means being a more informed citizen and a more careful observer of the economy. Because history shows us this. People who do not understand financial systems often realize the effects of decisions only when it is already too late. But when you begin to understand the system, even a little, you can see the language being used, the decisions being made, and the results that emerge much more clearly. History may not always repeat itself exactly, but if we understand the methods used in the past, it becomes much easier to recognize similar situations in the present. Perhaps true financial freedom is not only about earning more money. It is also about understanding how money works, why its value changes, and how economic decisions affect our lives. If this video gave you a different perspective, do not forget to subscribe to the channel, because one of the best ways to understand the present is to look at the past.